The Army chase planes. When new aircraft are being flight tested, they are often followed by other aircraft called chase planes. The chase plane may carry a photographer or a flight test engineer, or sometimes it just has a chase pilot who observes the experimental craft from the outside and shepherds it along, calling out any anomalies they see. Optimally, a chase plane is a bit faster and at least as maneuverable as the test article, although this is not always possible, especially with high-performance research aircraft. The chase plane also needs good visibility, preferably with a bubble canopy, to allow it an unrestricted view of the target aircraft, even from directly underneath. With helicopters, the chase aircraft is often another helicopter, but that is not always possible. This leads us to a small but interesting chapter in U.S. Army aviation. But first, there are two important notes that must be mentioned as they relate directly to this story. The first is the 1948 Key West Agreement between the Army and the newly founded U.S. Air Force, which outlined the roles of each service. The Army was not to have fixed-wing combat aircraft, but was allowed fixed-wing transport and surveillance aircraft, some of which did carry guns for defense and also carried target-marking rockets. The Army was also allowed helicopters, but bear in mind that when this agreement was reached, rotary-winged aircraft had very limited capabilities. The second note is that on the 27th of January, 1957, the last North American P-51 Mustangs in squadron service with the United States Air Force were retired from the 167th Fighter Squadron, West Virginia Air National Guard. This seemingly ended the Mustang service with the United States military, but the mighty Mustang had one more surprise in store, and a decade later a handful of these planes would find their way back into the inventory of the United States military. Not with the Air Force, but with the Army. Now we jump forward to 1964, and the Army is beginning a new competition for its proposed Advanced Aerial Fire Support System, which is government speak for a dedicated attack helicopter. Normally, a helicopter would be used to chase the new attack helicopter prototypes, but Lockheed's submission to the competition, the AH-56 Cheyenne, was over 40 knots faster than any rotorcraft the Army had. The Cheyenne flew at 190 knots in normal flight with a top speed of 212 knots. Since there was simply no helicopter in the inventory fast enough for high-speed chase flights, the Army looked for a fixed-wing chase plane for the high-speed chase mission. But its T-42 Cochise and U-8 Seminole had marginal performance for the job and lacked the unrestricted visibility required. The Army still needed helicopters to provide chase in certain flight regimes such as hover, transition, and low-speed flight, but the high-speed runs needed a fast and maneuverable airplane. For these reasons, the Army would end up acquiring 3 North American Mustangs, a basically stock F-51D and 2 Cavalier Mustangs. These were fully demilitarized, which meant they had no guns, gun sights, nor armor. The first Mustang the Army acquired was simply bought on the commercial market. It was originally a North American P-51D, serial number 44-72990. The first 2 digits of the serial number indicated the year it was ordered, 1944, although it was built in 1945. In June of 1948, the newly formed United States Air Force redesignated its pursuit planes as fighters, and the Ps became Fs, ergo the P-51D became an F-51D. Records show it went to the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1951, which retired it in 1958. It was then sold to surplus to American buyers, James DeFuria and Fred Ritz of Intercontinental Airways of Canastota, New York. They were buying and reselling ex-Canadian F-51s for the civilian market. The plane changed hands 7 more times before it was acquired by the Army in 1967, specifically as a chase plane for the Cheyenne. It spent much of its time at Edwards Air Force Base in Yuma Proving Grounds, where the Cheyennes did much of their test work. After operating the Mustang, the Army was so pleased with it that they decided to acquire 2 more, 1967 to 1968. At the time, civilian Mustangs were quite affordable by Army standards, and their serviceability and handling were excellent. Spare parts were still plentiful, and they had a second seat installed in the old radio compartment behind the pilot. This made room for a test engineer or photographer along with their equipment, but they did not have dual controls. They were nearly as maneuverable as a Cheyenne and could go even faster. They had no real safety issues and were liked by the chase pilot. One of the Air Force chase pilots at Edwards commented that he saw one of the Army's Mustangs and admired it with envy. The Army's next two Mustangs were Cavalier conversions. Cavalier was a company that was founded in 1957 as Trans-Florida Aviation. Its business model was to acquire the F-51s that were leaving military service with the aforementioned West Virginia Air National Guard in 1957 and convert them for private use. CEO David Lindsay's idea was to make a fast executive transport in the days before business jets. In 1957, the Mustang was about the fastest thing a civilian could lay their hands on. Trans-Florida zero-timed the airframes, rebuilt the engines, and made bulged-out canopies to provide headroom for the rear seat passenger. As previously mentioned, with the military radios removed, there was room for a passenger and a luggage compartment. 2 removable fuel tanks were mounted on the wingtips, and the tail fin was replaced by a new design which was 18 inches taller. The Mustang was not the only aircraft type being considered as a chase plane for the Cheyenne. Cavalier tried to interest the Army in using its highly modified Mustang III, which replaced the piston engine with a Rolls-Royce Dart turboprop. The Cessna T-37 Tweet jet trainer, which was also in use by the Air Force, was also considered. It met all the criteria and had 2 engines for safety. The exact reasons the Army chose the Cavalier Mustangs are not noted, or at least not that I could find, but the airplanes were affordable, well-known, reliable, and the Army was very happy with the one they already had. They did not need the complexity or performance offered by the Mustang III, and the T-37 was a new airplane, ergo it had no track record or experience base within the Army. Additionally, there was some government interest in promoting the Cavalier Company for possible assistance in foreign sales to countries the United States wanted to help. The Cavalier Mustangs were sent to Fort Rucker, and they worked exceptionally well in their role as chase planes for the Cheyenne. The Army even issued a new pilot's manual for the F-51 in 1968, which was tailored for the chase plane role. Of the 3 planes, the original Mustang the Army bought was considered a favorite with the mechanics who said it was less demanding to maintain. In fact, I found comments claiming that the 2 Cavalier rebuilds suffered from some notable quality control issues in both the engines and their supporting systems. The final round of Cheyenne test flights was completed in 1972. The program was canceled for a host of reasons which were more political than technical, but the Mustangs had proven themselves as good chase aircraft and remained in service after the Cheyenne's cancellation. They were used in the later AH-1S Cobra, AH-64 Apache, and UH-60 Blackhawk test programs. But by the late 1970s, the Army was ready to move on from the Mustangs. With the cancellation of the Cheyenne, their high speed was no longer needed. But there was one final hurrah for one of the Army's Mustangs, and this one came at the hands of the Marines. In 1974, the Navy Department wanted to test a concept for a low-cost air-to-ground weapon to arm Marine Corps forward air control and tactical reconnaissance aircraft. The main aircraft they had in mind was the OV-10 Bronco. It was theorized that a recoilless rifle mounted on a plane might be the best option, but there were many issues with this idea that needed to be researched. One was how would the weapon's backblast affect airflow over the plane's tail. Also, a recoilless rifle's round flies a relatively flat profile, as the weapon was designed to be static fired on the ground, so it was unclear how it would perform when fired from an aircraft. Since the Army had no further use for the Mustangs, it loaned one of the Cavaliers to the Naval Air Weapons Station, China Lake, for Marine Corps use. It was armed with 2 M40 105mm recoilless rifles, one on each wingtip. The Mustang was flown by Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel John Pipa, but remained in its U.S. Army livery. During the spring of 1974, the idea was tested against 2 Target Hulk trucks in the desert. Firing took place with the fighter in a 22-degree dive at 250 knots, from 5,072 yards, or roughly 2 3/4 miles, of straight line of sight distance for the pilot. Out of 8 shots from the Mustang, 1 direct hit on the truck was scored. The other 7 rounds landed in a tight grouping. The Marine Corps concluded that the marginal inaccuracy was likely due to flexing of the Mustang's wings. It was later determined the guns had done considerable twisting of the wings, but the pilot reported that the backblast of the M40s did not disrupt the airflow around the tail, and in fact, the only noticeable effect was an extremely loud noise when fired, but that is common to all recoilless rifles. The concept was basically successful, but the Navy was unable to glean congressional support, and the idea died. The U.S. Navy's budget for the whole recoilless rifle project was only $95,000, which would have easily been exceeded just by the flight hour cost of a modern jet alone. With the test program complete, the Navy was advised that the Army did not want the test Cavalier back. So, with the other Cavalier already sold off by the Army, Cavalier 68-15796 was sold by the Navy to a civilian buyer in 1974. It changed hands several times, but now resides in the Air Force Armament Museum at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The last of the Mustangs to go was the mechanic's favorite, the ex-Royal Canadian Air Force F-51D, but the Army did not completely get rid of it. Chase pilot Larry Klein, a retired Air Force pilot who had become a civilian chase pilot, finished the Mustang's last chase flight for the Army. The aircraft was handed over to Colonel Dennis M. Boyle, commander of the Army Aviation Engineering Flight Activity, who flew it on its last flight to the Army Aviation Museum in Fort Rucker, Alabama, to be put on display. It still resides there today, although it's not on public display at the moment. With that, the Mustang's career with the U.S. military ended. The Army needed something to replace the F-51s and chose former Navy T-28B Trojans. Since the high-speed capabilities were no longer needed, the Trojans worked well. Rugged, highly maneuverable, and slower than the Mustangs, the Trojans were perfect for the Army missions of chasing helicopters and for supporting parachute testing. I have found 3 of them, but in various paint schemes, and I'm not certain how many the Army had in total. The Army used them until at least 1984, although they still had Bureau number 140048 until 1987, when it was sent to the Museum of the United States Air Force. It was displayed outdoors for years, but it's currently on indoor display in South Vietnamese markings. Bureau number 137702 is on display at the Museum Air Park at Edwards Air Force Base, which is where these chase planes did much of their work, but you must have base access to visit the museum. One of the former Army Trojans still flies privately in Australia, and at least one other is in U.S. Army markings in Canada, but I do not know if it is one of the planes the Army actually used. As I was finishing the script for this, I had a thought that I've never seen mentioned before. Amongst aviation and military buffs, the cancellation of the Cheyenne program has always been considered controversial, the Air Force feeling that it intruded on their missions. And then I realized something. The Mustangs would never have been brought back into military service if it had not been for the Cheyenne program. The fact that a former Air Force fighter plane was needed to provide chase gave tacit admission to the Air Force's claim that the Cheyenne was a Pandora's box for Army aviation. After all, if the Army can have an expensive, highly sophisticated, high-speed, stubbed-wing, pusher-prop, close-support attack ship just because it has rotor blades, what other Air Force missions might they encroach on by saying, it's just a helicopter? The Air Force understandably felt the program intruded on their side of the Key West Agreement. They were fine with the Army flying armed helicopters, but the Cheyenne was so unexpectedly advanced and expensive that the Air Force saw it as a direct intrusion on their close air support mission. Even the AH-1 Cobra, which was an evolution of the venerable UH-1 Huey, had drawn a wary eye from the Air Force, so when the Cheyenne came along, they lobbied Congress to cancel the program. In response to this, in 1972, the U.S. Army started a new competition. This one was called the Advanced Attack Helicopter Competition. It was for an eventual replacement for the AH-1 Cobra. This time, the Pentagon added 2 engines as a criterion, thus eliminating the single-engine Cheyenne from resubmission in the new competition. The AH-64 Apache would win that competition, and once again, the Mustangs provided chase. So that's the story of the Army chase planes, a quiet little niche in aviation history. I'm Max of Pilots and Prop Wash. Safe flights and early arrivals.